The Goblet of Fire is a fantastic book, which marks an integral turning point in the Harry Potter series. Not only is it very large compared to J.K. Rowling's previous works, but it switches the mood of Harry's life as things go from fun and fantastical to serious and even heart-wrenching. Every book after this seems to get darker and darker as Harry Potter battles with Voldemort to decide the fate of the wizarding world. Unfortunately, when adapting such a large book to film, a lot of important scenes and details get left out. Things like Quidditch, Spew, and the true fate of the Riddle family are completely removed from the movie. So today, as we kick off Season 4 of my series Movies vs. Manuscripts, we'll be taking a look at the first few chapters of this essential book. Because as it turns out, the first scene of the movie left out nearly 5 chapters from the original story. So join me as we dive into the book and compare it to this scene of the movie to uncover everything you might have missed. And trust me, I think by the end of this video, you'll have learned something about the wizarding world that you didn't know before. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 43 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Harry Potter Edition. As always, I'll cover all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's actually summarize what does get shown in the first scene of the film. That way it's fresh on our mind as we dive into the book version. The movie starts off on an ominous tone as we see Nagini the snake slithering through a graveyard at night. But we realize it's not just any graveyard as the camera pans to one of the tombstones which shows 3 people with the last name Riddle. We then cut to an old man who seems to be the caretaker of this property as he makes tea in the middle of the night. He looks out the window and sees a flickering light in the mansion that he looks after, and so he storms up to the home to see what's going on, assuming that it's some of the local kids messing around. As he walks up the stairs inside the large home, he overhears voices, and we see Wormtail and hear the voice of Voldemort. They're discussing some sort of plan regarding Harry Potter, and then we see a new character who seems to be a faithful servant of the Dark Lord. Unfortunately, before we get any further into their plot, Nagini slithers up the stairs and into the room, informing Voldemort of the Muggle caretaker who is eavesdropping outside the door. Once revealed, Voldemort performs the killing curse, and the scene ends with a bright flash of green light and Harry waking up from a bad dream at the Weasleys. And that short bit is what we're covering today. You might be thinking, really? They crammed 5 chapters into just that one quick scene? Well, not really, because in reality, they just removed 4 chapters entirely, and then they used small parts of the first chapter for this scene. But before we get into the plot changes and look at every juicy detail that was cut, let's quickly go over our first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. First, for characters, we're missing quite a few because of these removed chapters. Of course, as with most Harry Potter books, we begin at the Dursleys. But in the movie, we cut straight to Harry at the Burrow. That means that we're missing Vernon, Petunia, and Dudley. Now, just because we cut to the Burrow doesn't mean that we see all the right characters there, because in the book, Harry finally meets Bill and Charlie Weasley, the older 2 boys. Plus, we see Molly Weasley and Percy. In the movie, we very quickly just cut from Harry waking up to them heading to the World Cup. Also, regarding characters who aren't seen but just discussed, we're missing any mention of Bertha Jorkins, Ludo Bagman, and Barty Crouch Sr. These characters will become a crucial part of the plot later on, and these early chapters are foreshadowing for the massive roles that they'll play, but that'll come up more in the plot changes. Now, besides those character omissions, we have one character who is shown in the movie, but isn't shown in the book, and that is Barty Crouch Jr. In the book, Voldemort mentions this character as a faithful servant, but we don't get a name, and he isn't there with Wormtail and Voldemort at the Riddle House. Now, moving on from characters, we have timeline, and you might have already noticed the issue here. As with most of the movies, they quickly speed through Harry's summer and get straight to the school year. But most Harry Potter books begin at Harry's birthday, which is July 31st. That means that there's still about a month left before the school year begins, and so in the book, Harry has his nightmare about the Riddle House while he is still at the Dursleys, not when he's at the Weasleys. And then even when he's at the Weasleys, there's about 2 weeks before he goes to school. Now lastly, before we jump into the plot changes, we have location, and there are only a couple discrepancies here between the book and movie. First, Little Hangleton, which is the town that the Riddle family lived in, is not mentioned at all in the movie. But the first chapter of the book heavily revolves around it and the mystery of the Riddle family deaths. And second, we are of course missing the Dursleys' home. Now, before I go diving into the plot changes, I just want to take this time to thank Cody, Jason, Joshua, and all of my other incredible Patreon supporters who make videos like this possible every month. Also, I want to remind you that I can't go word for word through the book and movie because obviously they won't be identical when it comes to dialogue. But if you're looking to relive these moments yourself word for word, then I highly recommend checking out the audiobooks on Audible. You can claim your free trial using my link in the description, which gets you one free audiobook of your choice and supports the channel at the same time. So if you want, you can grab the Goblet of Fire and follow along with me each episode. Anyway, all that being said, let's head into the all-important category of plot changes. Just a heads up, although we will be addressing some differences between the book and movie, most of what we're covering today will be going over each chapter that was entirely removed. So once we get through chapter 1, which is the only part that relates to the scene in the movie, we'll be unpacking chapters 2 through 5 and revealing every detail of the plot that you missed or have forgotten. Anyway, like I said, let's kick things off with the first change, which is all about the Riddle House. You see, despite this first chapter of the book being the inspiration for the first scene of the movie, there's still a lot that didn't make the cut. Specifically, the movie just jumps straight to Nagini slithering along in the graveyard, and then the caretaker, who we learn is named Frank, walking up to the mansion where he finds Wormtail and Voldemort. But the book doesn't start there. Instead, it gives us a brief backstory of what happened to the Riddle family, which is essential to the plot and helps us better understand Voldemort not only in this book, but in the Half-Blood Prince and the Deathly Hallows, as Harry tracks down Voldemort's past and his Horcruxes. The book starts by telling us about the town of Little Hangleton and its inhabitants, who love to gossip about what they called the Riddle House, despite the fact that the Riddle family hadn't lived there for about 50 years. But 50 years ago, the events that took place there were so astonishing that they have lived on and on. What had happened was that one day a maid of the fine estate walked into the room to find Mr. and Mrs. Riddle dead on the floor along with their son. The maid had run to the village and told everyone what she saw. After the police were summoned, a man named Frank Bryce was arrested, and this man was none other than the caretaker of the estate. He lived in a cottage on the property and is the same man that we see in the first scene of the movie. But at the time of the Riddle family deaths, he would have been 50 years younger. After coming back from the war, he had taken a job with the Riddles, and after being arrested, the gossip grew to its peak with people saying that the war turned him funny and he was never a likable man. The Riddle family's cook didn't help this, as she told the villagers that Frank was the only one with a key to get into the house, and therefore he must be at fault. Frank, on the other hand, repeated his innocence over and over to the police and told them that he had seen a dark-haired teenage boy near the house that day. I'll give you one guess who that was. Anyway, to everyone's surprise, Frank Bryce was set free by the police after the Riddle's autopsy report came in. It was perhaps the most shocking report that the police had ever seen, as it stated that the doctor could find absolutely nothing wrong with the bodies. For all intents and purposes, each member of the Riddle family was in perfect health, except for the fact that they were dead. But with that proof, Frank was freed and resumed his work on the estate, and worked for each owner after the Riddles until eventually a wealthy man purchased the home for tax reasons. Frank continued to maintain what he could, but over the years, the local kids broke windows and did other things simply because the town of Little Hangleton still believed Frank to be guilty. And one night, when Frank's leg was hurting him, he woke up to have some tea and looked out the window to see flickering lights in the old Riddle house. Believing it to be some local kids setting fire to the place, he stormed out and found himself in a very strange situation. Now, before we move on to the next few changes regarding this scene, I want to just emphasize the importance of this first story. Knowing what happened to the Riddles might seem trivial, but it plays a role in the plot later on in the Harry Potter series, as we learn about Voldemort's father. Plus, it simply gives context to why Harry finds himself in a random graveyard later in the book, and why Voldemort and Wormtail are hiding in this home specifically. It isn't random. It is very connected to Voldemort, or should I say Tom Riddle's, past. Now, moving on to the next part of this chapter, Frank makes his way up the stairs of the Riddle home and overhears a conversation between Wormtail and Voldemort. Remember, Barty Crouch Jr. is not at the Riddle house with them like the movie shows. He is simply mentioned by Voldemort and not even by name. But the next change we have is really just the massive difference in conversation between the book and movie as Wormtail and Voldemort talk. I know I don't like to go into dialogue, but this is more than dialogue, as what they discuss gives us hints as to the future of the plot. Obviously, the movie version is extremely short, but the book version is quite long. Here are a few key things that we learn during this conversation. 1. Wormtail is nursing Voldemort back to health. Literally. At one point, Voldemort asks where Nagini is, and Wormtail says that she was exploring the house. And then Voldemort says that she will need to be milked before they go to sleep, because he will need nursed in the middle of the night, as the journey has exhausted him. And throughout the conversation, we can tell that Wormtail absolutely hates this task. I highly doubt Nagini is fond of being milked. I don't even know what that means, and I don't think I want to know. The second thing we miss is that we learn that Voldemort has a plan, but it cannot proceed before the Quidditch World Cup. The third thing is that Wormtail seems to be hesitant to harm Harry Potter. He actually gets the courage to tell Voldemort that he thinks they should continue with the plan, but without the boy, saying that they can use any wizard. Voldemort insists, however, that it must be Harry Potter and questions Wormtail's loyalty. Wormtail says that he could go out and find another wizard to use, but Voldemort claims that that would just be a way for Wormtail to escape and leave him to die. Fourth, this is when Voldemort mentions that Wormtail won't be alone in getting Harry Potter, because by then his faithful servant will have joined them, meaning Barty Crouch Jr. Wormtail is hurt by this and says that he has been a faithful servant, and that he brought Voldemort Bertha Jorkins. He also says that the Ministry will notice Bertha's disappearance, but we learn that Bertha had some sort of information that was invaluable to Voldemort. What that information is, we don't yet know. At this point in the conversation, Frank, who has been listening the whole time, realizes that Bertha has been murdered by these men, and that they are planning to murder again. These weren't kids from Little Hangleton, but hardened criminals. Unfortunately for Frank, Nagini slithered past right at that moment and delivered the news about the Muggle to Voldemort. Which brings us to the next change, and that is the fact that after Frank is spotted, Voldemort invites him inside the room. He doesn't kill him immediately, but rather Frank tells him that he's heard everything they've said and that he's got enough to go to the police. But of course, he doesn't make it that far. After a bit of back and forth, Voldemort has Wormtail turn his chair around so he can face the Muggle, and Wormtail reluctantly does so. Then, after revealing himself to Frank, he kills him, and Harry wakes up. Now, I know that was a lot of information that we just covered, and it seems like more than just a couple of changes, but here's the main gist of things. Voldemort is planning something and used information from a Ministry of Magic employee named Bertha Jorkins. Voldemort also has a faithful servant who will infiltrate Hogwarts. And last, but certainly not least, Wormtail has a soft spot for Harry and is definitely in a toxic relationship. He hates Voldemort, but continues to do his bidding when he literally could leave him to die if he wanted to. This will come into play in a later book as Wormtail comes face to face with Harry, and unlike the movie which shows Wormtail smiling as Frank gets murdered, book Wormtail is reluctant to let the old Muggle in because he knows what will happen. Wormtail is near whimpering when it happens, as if every time Voldemort kills an innocent person, it hurts him more and more. But now that you've got a grasp on that first chapter and how it relates to this scene in the movie, we can jump into the next 4 chapters and unpack everything that happens from the time Harry wakes up to when he gets to the Weasleys. Now, the good news is that chapter 2, which is titled The Scar, is pretty simple, and I can skip most of it. As J.K. Rowling does in all the Harry Potter books, she uses this chapter to essentially recap and reintroduce the reader to all the essential elements of the story. The key characters, the wizarding world, and recent events, which in this case would be Sirius Black, who has just come into the story at the end of the previous school year. So, skipping over all of that recap, the only thing of note that happens here, and as a change from the movie, is the fact that Harry writes up a letter to Sirius right after having this nightmare about Voldemort, which caused his scar to hurt. In the movie, they only have this happen when the trio are on the Hogwarts Express, and Hermione has to remind Harry to write to Sirius. But in the book, we learn that Harry and his godfather have written back and forth a couple of times over the summer already. So anyway, after this recap of Harry's life and the letter being written to Sirius, the chapter ends and we can move on to chapter 3, which is called The Invitation. This chapter primarily focuses on reintroducing us to Harry's life at the Dursleys, and then shares a key detail, which is the fact that Harry receives an invitation to go to the Quidditch World Cup with the Weasleys. This chapter isn't so much necessary information as it is just fun character building context that brings us further into the story. Here are the main points. First, we learn about Dudley and how he had officially gotten so large that his private school no longer made clothes large enough for him to wear. Therefore, the school nurse had given him a strict diet to follow over the summer. And in an attempt to make Dudley feel more comfortable with it, Aunt Petunia was forcing everyone in the house to follow the diet. So, the morning after this nightmare, Harry went downstairs to breakfast and found a measly quarter of a grapefruit on his plate. Now, Harry had got wind of this new diet and immediately sent letters to his friends, telling them about this atrocity. They answered in full force by sending him pies, candy, snacks, and more to help him get through the summer. So Harry hid these items under the loose floorboard in his bedroom, and because of this, he didn't complain or anything when given the small diet portions. After all, he could go back upstairs to his room and eat whatever he wanted there. Anyway, while at breakfast, the mailman knocks on the door and hand-delivers a letter to Vernon, who yells for Harry. Vernon then shows Harry a letter which is completely covered in stamps and explains that this is an invitation from a Molly Weasley for Harry to accompany them to the Quidditch World Cup. At this, Harry is simultaneously excited and devastated. On one hand, this is the opportunity of a lifetime, but on the other, Harry knows that his uncle hates any talk of wizards or magic, and explaining to him what Quidditch is would be impossible. Plus, Mrs. Weasley requested that Harry send a reply in the quote, normal way, meaning by owl. But to Vernon, that is far from the normal way. Also, he tells Harry that the mailman laughed and was very curious about where the letter came from. And if you know anything about the Dursleys, you know that they hate people looking at them as if they're abnormal. But all hope isn't lost just yet, because Harry has a very special card up his sleeve. He tells Vernon that he gets it, he just won't go to the World Cup. Then he asks if he can go up to his room so he can write a letter to his godfather. After all, Sirius will want to know how he's doing. Now, it's key to remember that Harry had told Vernon about Sirius, but had neglected to mention his innocence. So as far as Uncle Vernon knows, Harry has a godfather who is a mass murderer, and if he doesn't let Harry write to him, then Sirius will think that Harry is being mistreated. But if Harry writes him and tells him that he wasn't allowed to go to the World Cup, then Sirius will think that Harry is being mistreated. Slowly, Vernon came to the realization that he had to let Harry go to the World Cup, and so he tells him yes. And with that, Harry went upstairs to find Hedwig and Pig, Ron's owl, in his room. Ron had sent a letter saying that they were coming to get Harry regardless of the Dursleys' answer, but Harry wrote back and told him that they're in the clear. Then he sent Sirius's letter as well now that Hedwig was back. And that is the end of Chapter 3. Like I said, this chapter isn't so much a necessity as it is just fun context that progresses the story in a more natural way than the movie does. Personally, I think the movie jumps around quite a bit at the beginning here, and I never really liked how Harry just wakes up at the Weasleys and we have no context as to how or why he got there. But anyway, we can't dwell on that too long, because we still have 2 more chapters left to discuss. Next up is Chapter 4, which is called Back to the Burrow. This chapter is all about the arrival of the Weasleys at the Dursleys and their journey back to the Burrow, and it's a pretty funny one. Once again, this one takes a backseat when it comes to super important and crucial plot details, but it is massive in building the characters we already have in the story, specifically Fred and George. You see, the Weasleys were meant to pick up Harry at 5 o'clock on that Sunday, and the Dursleys were not at all prepared for how these unique guests would arrive. Assuming that they'd come through the front door, Harry didn't think to check the fireplace until they heard loud noises banging around behind the electric fire which had been installed over the old fireplace. Harry could hear the voices of Mr. Weasley, Fred, George, and Ron as they all got crammed into the dark fireplace one by one. Obviously, they had traveled by the Floo network. Eventually, Mr. Weasley did the only thing possible and used a spell to completely blow up the electric fireplace, trapping them inside. Of course, he'd put it back together before he left, but the Dursleys didn't know that and were completely devastated at the state of their sitting room. This act confirmed their beliefs about wizards and how inhuman they are. But the most important part of this chapter isn't necessarily the arrival, but rather their exit. You see, as they left one by one, Fred accidentally dropped a load of candies on the floor right in front of Dudley. He picked them up one by one and then left with George. Ron went after him, and then only Harry and Mr. Weasley were left with the Dursleys. Unfortunately, before they could get away without any incidents, they suddenly heard a gagging noise and spun around to see Dudley choking on a massive tongue. His tongue had grown to about 4 feet long, and Aunt Petunia started tugging on it, trying to rip it out of his mouth, making Dudley choke even harder. Mr. Weasley knew immediately what had happened, as he and Harry saw a candy wrapper on the ground, and he told Vernon and Petunia that he could fix it easily. But Vernon, who had a horrible experience last time with Hagrid giving Dudley a pig's tail, started grabbing china from the mantel and tossing it at Mr. Weasley. One by one, Mr. Weasley dodged the china and got more and more irritated, telling Harry to go ahead and leave. So Harry got in the fireplace and left, taking the Floo network to arrive back at the Burrow. And that brings us to the final chapter of this episode, which is Chapter 5 and is called Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. This one is also a fun chapter, but has a lot more to do with the plot as we get introduced to new characters, learn about Fred and George's underground joke shop, and hear about some goings-on at the Ministry. So from the top, here's what the movie cut. As soon as Harry made it out of the fireplace, Fred and George were on him asking if Dudley ate the candy. Harry said yeah, and then asked what it was, learning that the candy was called Tun Tung Toffee. Say that 5 times fast. Eventually, Mr. Weasley arrived and scolded the boys. He was soon after joined by Mrs. Weasley, and Hermione and Ginny took Ron and Harry upstairs to leave the twins alone with their parents. Hermione and Ginny then explained to Harry what Weasley's Wizard Wheezes were, as Mrs. Weasley had mentioned that name before they left. Evidently, over the summer, Fred and George had been in their room concocting their own candies and wizard joke toys. They not only were making them, but were selling them. Mrs. Weasley had found a stack of order forms with the title Weasley's Wizard Wheezes on them, and she got into a massive argument with the twins over it. She ended up burning the order forms and forbidding them from continuing, telling them that they needed to devote themselves to school, but they told her that all they want to do is drop out and start a joke shop. On the flip side, we run into Percy, who meets Harry and the others in the hallway asking what all the noise is, and telling them that he's trying to focus on a very important report that he's making regarding cauldron imports. We learn during this moment that Percy officially works for the Ministry of Magic now. After Percy leaves them, Ron tells Harry how he is non-stop about the Ministry, always talking about his boss, Mr. Crouch. So much so that Ron is expecting them to get married any day now. And this is a crucial part, because in the movie we get no indication about this, but Barty Crouch Sr. is Percy's boss in this book. Anyway, the chapter moves on to dinner, and that is when the topic of Ludo Bagman comes up. This is a book-only character, but someone who we'll see many times throughout this book. He is no trivial person and has a hand in multiple plot lines. Percy mentions him as the head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports, saying that he is not offering the cooperation that they need in his department. Mr. Weasley pipes up and defends Bagman, saying that is who they got the World Cup tickets from. But Percy and Mr. Weasley agree on one thing. One of Mr. Bagman's employees, Bertha Jorkins, has been missing for a month, and Bagman doesn't seem to be worried about it. Once again, Bertha Jorkins' name is appearing, and it won't be the last time. I know it's not something we can cover today, but hopefully you tuck it away and continue along with me in this series as we analyze every scene of the Goblet of Fire and compare it to the book. But anyway, this final chapter wraps up with everyone heading to bed after dinner because of their early start the next morning, which will take them to the World Cup. And on that note, that wraps up everything the movie removed from the beginning of the Goblet of Fire. And now that I've yapped for long enough, it's time for you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know which of these chapters you would have included, or perhaps you think they did it the right way by cutting all of them. Regardless, drop a comment and leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to stick with me throughout this season of Movies vs. Manuscripts, because this book is where things get good. However, it will be quite the adventure to compare these two mediums of the same story. As we know, they're just so drastically different. Anyway, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.